It wasn't the lack of love, it was this ghostly echo of it that haunted me for years. Just a hollow form, a fragile thing that Richard and I propped up with careful words, programmed gestures, practiced smiles. Like so many couples in our circle, we knew the steps of synchronized silence, each of us lost in our own meticulously constructed worlds. But silence, stretched too thin, snap, cracks spiderweb across that shell until you're staring at the void underneath. I never imagined a weekend escape to the misty Catskills, meant to glue us back together, would be the match that ignited everything. And I sure as hell didn't foresee the proposition Richard would lay out one still evening, the New York sky bleeding into night outside our cabin window. A proposition that ripped apart everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and most strangely, the man I'd spent almost 40 years beside. It all started with a question I never expected, and an answer I wasn't sure I could ever give. The mountains blurred past the window of the helicopter, a jagged green chaos under a heavy sky. Richard, across from me, was lost in his phone, his face lit up by the cold blue screen. I watched him. The sharp angles of his face, familiar as my own hand, the lines etched deeper around his mouth. Once, I'd loved every detail. Now, it felt like a mask, fixed and distant, as if the man I married had vanished somewhere beyond my reach. Distance was Richard's practiced art. His presence, a faint echo in our sprawling, expensively furnished life, had become something I'd just learned to live with. It started subtly, missed calls, conversations that evaporated before they began. But as years bled into decades, I saw the chasm widening between us, a gulf so immense that even when we were physically close, I felt utterly alone. When he suggested this retreat, a sliver of hope flickered. Maybe here, far from his Manhattan empire, he'd finally see me again. But as the weekend dragged on, that hope withered. The first bonding exercise was excruciating. We sat in a sterile conference room with a dozen other couples, a therapist with a relentless smile guiding us through questions meant to dredge up our innermost thoughts. I watched the other couples lean in, whispering, laughing, hands finding each other in small, intimate gestures. When it was our turn, Richard answered each question with chilling precision, his responses clipped, calculated. It was like he was in a board meeting, not baring his soul to his wife of 38 years. When our score came back, the lowest in the entire retreat, a wave of shame washed over me. I avoided Richard's gaze, feeling exposed, the hollowness of our marriage laid bare for all to see. Later that evening, back in our sterile cabin, we ate dinner in near silence. I forced myself to look up from my untouched plate. Did the score bother you?
Yeah.
He shrugged, slicing his steak with methodical precision. It's just an exercise, Eleanor. Don't take it personally. Of course he wouldn't. Richard was a man of facts, of logic, of cold, hard reason. Emotions were messy, inconvenient nuisances to be endured only when absolutely necessary. But then, after a long pause, he looked up, a strange glint in his eyes. Do you think we'd score higher with someone else? The question hung between us, strange and unsettling. What do you mean? He put down his fork, folding his hands neatly on the table. If the point of this retreat is to confront the state of our relationship, why don't we try a different approach? I stared at him, the absurdity of his suggestion seeping into my brain. What kind of approach? And that's when he said it. I've been talking to David lately, about his wife, Sarah. He's told me how unhappy she is, how they've drifted apart. His eyes searched mine. Maybe if we each spent time with someone who understands that distance, that kind of loneliness, it might give us a new perspective. The silence that followed was immense, suffocating. I couldn't tell if I was shocked, appalled, or strangely intrigued. My mind raced, a chaotic storm of questions, none of which I dared to voice. It felt like we were teetering on the edge of a precipice, about to plunge into forbidden territory. A line, once crossed, could never be erased. But Richard, in his calm, steady way, simply waited for my response, his gaze unwavering. I felt the weight of his words settle on me, each one an anchor dragging me deeper into a place I never imagined. Richard and I had crossed unspoken lines before, the kind that allowed us to lead parallel lives within our marriage, the tacit boundaries that let us pretend everything was fine, as long as no one looked too closely. But this was a bold, unmistakable line, one that could never be undone. I don't understand, I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. You want us to experiment? Richard nodded, his face expressionless. Think of it as an exercise, like this retreat. It's about seeing ourselves through a different lens. You'd spend time with David, and I'd do the same with Sarah, just for a short period, see what we discover about ourselves. I stared at him, searching his face for any hint of mischief, some flicker that would betray this was all a game. But there was nothing, just the same stoic calm that had drawn me to him all those years ago, the kind of calm that now felt like a million miles away, unreachable. David and Sarah, do they know about this idea? My question came out sharper than I intended, my voice trembling with a strange, quiet fear. They do, he said, meeting my gaze. We discussed it. They're open to it, and they're curious. The thought of David Riley, a close friend, someone I'd known for years, suddenly occupying this bizarre new role in my life felt surreal. He was attractive, in a quiet, unassuming way, a history professor with a dry wit I'd always appreciated. But that appreciation was distant, abstract. I'd never looked at him like that. And yet, beneath the shock, a whisper of intrigue stirred, a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet thrill. I don't know, Richard, I said, my voice barely audible. This feels unthinkable. But even as I said the words, my mind wandered to the possibility of something beyond the routine, the empty spaces Richard had left unfilled. He leaned back, hands clasped in his lap. I'm not suggesting this to hurt you, Eleanor. This is about honesty, facing the truth of where we are without hiding behind convention. Honesty. Ironic. Coming from a man who had spent the better part of his life concealing his emotions behind the polished veneer of success. That night, I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling. Every part of me wanted to reject the idea, to pretend this conversation never happened. And yet, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered something different. What if? I woke the next morning with the unsettling realization that I had silently agreed to the unthinkable. Richard's proposition lingered, sharp edges both thrilling and terrifying. I'd nodded my head the night before, a silent acceptance that now felt both impulsive and inevitable. That evening, Richard arranged a private dinner at the cabin with David and Sarah, a calculated move designed to test the waters to ease us into this precarious arrangement. When the doorbell rang, my stomach clenched, a sudden flood of nerves, the kind I hadn't felt in decades. David entered first, his presence filling the room with a warmth that was a stark contrast to Richard's practiced reserve. He greeted me with a gentle smile, his eyes studying mine with a mix of curiosity and something else, something unreadable but intensely personal. I'd always known David as a quiet observer, a man of depth and subtle humor, someone who could listen for hours and make you feel like the most fascinating person in the world. Tonight, though, there was something different about him. The usual air of detachment was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that made me feel strangely vulnerable. Eleanor, he said, his voice soft. Richard told me about the retreat. Did he? I managed, glancing at Richard, who was observing us with an almost clinical interest. David nodded, his gaze steady. He mentioned the experiment. Sarah entered a moment later, moving with a quiet grace. She was younger than me, but there was a poise about her that made her seem timeless, unshakable. Unlike David, she offered no easy warmth, no comforting smile. Instead, she studied me with a measured, enigmatic look, as if she were sizing me up, weighing me against some silent criteria of her own. We settled into an uneasy dinner, the four of us circling each other like strangers in a strange new world. Richard dominated the conversation at first, steering it towards neutral topics, business ventures, mutual acquaintances. But there was an underlying tension that none of us could ignore, a weight pressing down on every word, every glance. Finally, David turned to me, breaking the forced pleasantries. So, Eleanor, he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, what do you hope to find in this arrangement? His question caught me off guard, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I'm not sure yet, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I suppose I'm just curious. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Curiosity can be dangerous, he murmured, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary, but it's often the beginning of something important. Across the table, I felt Richard's eyes on me, watching my every reaction. I couldn't read his expression. Approval, jealousy, something else entirely. But there was a strange satisfaction in his gaze, as though he were witnessing a piece of his intricate plan falling into place. After dinner, we moved to the lounge, settling into separate corners of the room. Richard and Sarah engaged in a quiet conversation, their heads bent together, speaking in low voices. I tried to catch snippets of their exchange, but they were too far, their words lost in the soft hum of the fireplace. David sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, a quiet magnetic pull that made my heart race. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his voice so soft it was barely audible. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "A little," I admitted. "I've never done anything like this before." "Neither have I," he said, his expression thoughtful. "But there's something about it, about you, that makes me want to try." The air between us thickened, charged with unspoken tension, each of us caught in the pull of something we couldn't name. It was as if a barrier had been lifted, one that had held us apart for years, allowing us to see each other clearly for the first time. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and a spark jumped between us, a brief electric shock that jolted me back to life. In that moment, the boundaries of our marriage, our identities, our lives seemed to blur, leaving only the two of us in the quiet, trembling silence. Before I could respond, Richard's voice cut through the air, pulling us back to reality. "Shall we call it a night?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. A pang of disappointment, a strange ache I couldn't fully understand. David released my hand, his expression unreadable, and I felt the loss of his touch like a cold void. We rose, exchanging polite goodnights, but the tension lingered, an unspoken promise hanging between us like a secret. As Richard and I returned to our suite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably shifted, that we'd crossed a line that could never be redrawn. And yet, despite the fear, despite the doubt, I felt a spark of something new, something that had lain dormant for far too long. That night, as I lay beside Richard in the dark, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. For the first time in years, I felt alive, as though a door had opened in my life, leading to a world I'd never dared to explore. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to step through it, no matter what lay on the other side. The next day felt like the start of a journey I couldn't turn away from, even if I tried. Richard and I kept up the charade of normalcy, sharing polite conversation over breakfast, discussing the day's plans as if nothing unusual had occurred. But beneath the surface, there was a current of tension, an unspoken understanding that lingered in every glance, every word. David had invited me to meet him at a gallery downtown, a quiet, understated space showcasing local artists. He called it neutral ground, a place where we could talk without the expectations or constraints of our shared social circles. As I walked into the gallery, I felt a flutter of nerves, a feeling both exhilarating and terrifying. I spotted David near a painting, his attention focused on the canvas, his expression thoughtful. There was a calmness about him that put me at ease, a steady, grounding presence that made everything else fade away. "Eleanor," he said, turning to me with a smile, "I'm glad you came." His voice was warm, inviting, and I felt myself relax, the tension slipping from my shoulders. We began to wander through the gallery, stopping to admire the paintings, sharing quiet observations, easy laughter. For the first time in years, I felt seen, heard, valued for more than the role I played in someone else's life. And with each passing moment, I found myself drawn deeper into his world, into the possibility of something more, something real. We wandered the gallery, moving between exhibits with an unspoken rhythm, each piece of art sparking quiet exchanges that left lingering pauses and thoughtful silences. I found myself opening up to David, sharing thoughts I hadn't dared to voice aloud in years. He listened, never interrupting, his eyes meeting mine with a steady attentiveness that felt both comforting and thrilling. When we paused in front of a small, strikingly minimalist painting, David turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "Tell me, Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "what do you really want from this?" His question lingered in the air between us, a thin line daring me to step over it. I hesitated, my mind racing, but I couldn't avoid the truth. Not here, not with him. "I don't know yet," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I know that I can't keep going like this, feeling invisible." David's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand resting gently on my arm. "I understand," he said simply. "Sometimes we find ourselves living in a shadow, becoming what's expected of us, without realizing we've lost ourselves along the way." His words struck a chord deep within me, reverberating through the parts of myself I had buried beneath the weight of expectation and duty. "It's strange," I said, my voice trembling. "I feel like I'm rediscovering something I thought I'd lost forever, and yet I'm terrified." David's hand remained steady on my arm, his touch warm and grounding. "It's okay to be afraid, Eleanor. Sometimes fear is just a sign that we're stepping into something important, something that matters." I glanced at him, feeling the weight of his words settle over me, a quiet reassurance that made my heart beat just a little faster. There was something in his gaze, a glimmer of understanding that felt as though he could see through all the layers of my life, past the carefully crafted facades and down to the raw, vulnerable core of who I was. We left the gallery a short while later, the sun dipping low over the city skyline. As we walked back toward my apartment building in silence, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of the city. When we reached the entrance, David paused, turning to me with a soft smile. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said quietly, "for today, for sharing a part of yourself with me." His words held a weight I couldn't ignore, a quiet, unspoken promise that left me feeling both exhilarated and uncertain. I managed a small smile, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched him disappear into the city crowd, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When I returned to my penthouse, Richard was in his study, his face illuminated by the glow of his computer screen. He glanced up as I entered, his gaze sharp and appraising, as though he were trying to read the effect of my day with David on my face. There was a tension in the room, a charged silence that neither of us dared to break. Finally, he leaned back, folding his hands over his lap. "So how was your day?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, a faint hint of something that felt almost like jealousy, or perhaps something darker. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It was nice," I replied, careful to keep my voice even. "We talked, that's all." Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "I hope you're finding this experience valuable," he said, his voice low. I thought it might help us both see things more clearly. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of irritation at his choice of words. Valuable, as though our marriage was nothing more than an investment in need of a return. But I swallowed the comment, feeling the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. "And you?" I asked, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "Have you found any clarity?" He paused, his gaze shifting toward the window, where the last traces of daylight were beginning to fade. "Sarah has a way of grounding me," he said slowly. "She's different from you, Eleanor, quieter, more introspective. But she understands things that I've never taken the time to consider." A chill ran through me at his words, an unspoken truth settling over us. We were both stepping into a world that neither of us fully understood, a place where boundaries blurred and the familiar became foreign. And yet, I felt a strange exhilaration, a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. As the days passed, David and I continued to spend time together, our conversations growing deeper, our silences more comfortable. He became a mirror through which I began to see myself more clearly, not as Richard's wife, but as a person in my own right, a woman with thoughts, desires, and dreams that had been silenced for far too long. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside the window of David's cozy Brooklyn brownstone, we found ourselves sitting together on the fire escape, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. There was a stillness between us, a sense of anticipation that neither of us dared to acknowledge. "Eleanor," David said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart skip a beat. "Have you ever thought about what life would be like if things were different?" I glanced at him, feeling the depth of his question settle over me like a soft, unsettling fog. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "For so long I thought I knew what my life would look like, but now everything feels uncertain." David nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Uncertainty isn't always a bad thing," he murmured, his hand reaching out to brush against mine. "Sometimes it's the only way to find out who we really are." His touch lingered, a soft, subtle warmth that sent a shiver down my spine. There was an intimacy in that moment, a quiet understanding that felt deeper than words. I felt myself leaning into him, my defenses crumbling under the weight of his gaze. Just as I was about to respond, I heard a soft rustling behind us and turned to see Richard standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken boundary we had just crossed. Richard stepped forward, his gaze shifting between us. "I see you two have been enjoying each other's company," he said, his voice carefully measured. There was a hint of something in his tone, possessiveness perhaps, or jealousy that surprised me. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady, "we have." Richard's gaze lingered on me for a moment before he turned to David, his expression hardening. "I trust you'll remember the nature of our arrangement," he said quietly, his voice carrying a subtle warning. David met his gaze evenly, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "I haven't forgotten," he replied, his voice calm. "But sometimes, arrangements don't always go as planned." Richard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Be careful, David, he murmured, his tone laced with an edge that sent a chill down my spine. Some things are better left untouched. David held his ground, his expression unyielding. Perhaps, he said softly, but sometimes it's the things we're most afraid to touch that end up changing us the most. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken words and hidden meanings. I could feel the tension between them, a quiet battle of wills that left me feeling both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. As Richard turned and disappeared back inside, I felt a sense of dread settle over me, a realization that we had crossed into dangerous territory, a place where nothing would ever be the same. And yet, despite the fear, I felt a spark of defiance, a desire to reclaim the parts of myself I had long forgotten, the pieces I had buried beneath the weight of a life lived in someone else's shadow. Over the following days, a subtle but undeniable shift took place. Richard grew distant, his mood darkening, a sense of possessiveness emerging in ways I hadn't seen in years. There were hushed conversations with Sarah, whispers exchanged late at night, and moments where I caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. One evening, I overheard a fragment of their conversation, the words slipping through the thin walls like a dark secret. "She needs to remember where her loyalty lies," Richard murmured, his voice cold and unyielding. Sarah's voice was softer, almost soothing. "Give her time, Richard. She's been lost for so long. This is new for her." Their words unsettled me, stirring something deep within me, a sense of rebellion, a desire to break free from the gilded cage that had held me captive for so many years. I realized then that this arrangement, this experiment, had set something in motion that none of us could control. It wasn't just a question of loyalty or love, it was a battle for self-discovery, a journey toward reclaiming the pieces of ourselves that had been lost along the way. And as I lay awake that night, the weight of my choices pressing down on me, I knew that the only way forward was to embrace the uncertainty, to let the walls come down, and to find out who I truly was, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The following days turned our penthouse into a battlefield of glances, small gestures, and heavy silences. Richard's presence was no longer cool and indifferent. It was guarded, almost wary. He began watching me as though trying to read my thoughts, searching for signs of betrayal in the subtle gestures and glances I shared with David. It was as if he had willingly opened Pandora's box, yet felt unprepared for the chaos that spilled out. Sarah, too, seemed to sense the tension. Her calm facade began to waver as she noticed Richard's change in demeanor. She seemed to cling to him more closely, pulling him into hushed conversations on the terrace, her gaze flickering toward me with a look that was almost calculating. I hadn't anticipated this side of her, this quiet intensity that contrasted with the soft-spoken, observant woman I had known. One evening, as David and I prepared to head out for dinner, Sarah pulled me aside in the hallway, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor," she began, her hand brushing lightly over my arm. "Can we talk?" I nodded, my stomach tightening at the serious look in her eyes. She led me into the dimly lit library, the scent of old books filling the air. Sarah closed the door quietly behind us, her expression cautious, guarded. "Eleanor," she said softly, "I can see that things between you and David are growing closer." She paused, her fingers tracing the spine of a book on the shelf. "I just wanted to remind you of the nature of this arrangement. There's a lot at stake here. Richard is a powerful man, and he doesn't like surprises." Her words hung heavy in the air, a warning wrapped in subtle kindness. I felt my heart pound in my chest, a cold shiver running down my spine. This arrangement, this delicate balancing act, was beginning to crack under the strain. I realized that, for all her gentleness, Sarah had her own agenda, her own quiet need to maintain control over the situation. I forced a small smile, nodding. "Thank you, Sarah. I understand." But even as I said the words, I knew there was no turning back. That evening, as we gathered in the living room, the tension in the air was palpable. Richard's gaze was sharp and piercing, lingering on David and me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Sarah sat close to him, her hand resting on his arm as if to anchor him, her expression distant and thoughtful. When the conversation turned to the topic of secrets, David spoke up, his voice calm but pointed. "It's funny, isn't it, how we can think we know someone so well, yet find that they're capable of things we never imagined." His words struck a nerve, and I caught Richard's jaw tightening, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "Secrets can destroy people," Richard replied, his tone laced with something darker, something cold and unyielding, especially when they're hidden by the ones closest to us. The air grew heavy, the underlying threat in his words sending a chill through me. I glanced at David, who met my gaze with a look of quiet determination, as though he were standing his ground against an unseen enemy. In that moment, I realized that this arrangement was no longer a simple experiment. It had become a battleground, a place where loyalties, desires, and betrayals simmered beneath the surface. As the evening wore on, I found myself alone with David by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow over his face. He looked at me, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my heart race, the distance between us seeming to disappear in that quiet, fragile moment. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low and steady, "I don't want you to feel trapped. If this arrangement no longer feels right for you." I reached out, placing a hand over his, silencing his words. "It's not that simple, David," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "There's a part of me that's terrified, but there's another part that feels alive, in a way I haven't felt in years." David's gaze softened, his fingers brushing gently over mine. "Then let's face that fear together," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, I couldn't turn back. Not from him, not from the possibility of a life I had never dared to dream of. The following day, the fragile calm that had settled over us shattered in an instant. I was walking back from a walk in Central Park when I saw Richard and David standing near the building entrance, their voices low and tense. Richard's face was flushed, his eyes narrowed with anger, while David's stance was firm, unyielding. As I approached, their voices became clearer, the anger simmering beneath Richard's controlled facade finally breaking through. "Don't mistake her kindness for weakness, David," Richard was saying, his tone filled with a cold, quiet fury. "You think you can just walk into our lives and disrupt everything we've built?" David didn't flinch, his gaze steady. "Maybe it's time to question what you've built, Richard. Perhaps Eleanor deserves something more than half-hearted gestures and empty promises." Richard's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think this is some kind of romantic escape? It's not. This is my life, my marriage, and I won't let you ruin it with your idealistic nonsense." I stepped forward, unable to listen any longer. "Stop," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Both of you stop. This isn't about who's right or wrong, it's about choices we all made together." Richard turned to me, his expression softening for a brief moment before hardening again. "And what about your choice, Eleanor?" he asked quietly. "Are you really willing to throw everything away for this?" I felt a surge of anger rise within me, a fire that had been smoldering for far too long. "Maybe the life we built isn't what I want anymore, Richard," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Maybe I need something real, something that feels alive." My words hit him like a blow, and for the first time I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a glimmer of fear, of loss. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving David and me standing alone in the fading light, the weight of my words settling over us like a dark, unspoken promise. The days that followed were filled with a tense, uneasy silence. Richard and I barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own separate worlds, the chasm between us growing wider with each passing day. Sarah seemed equally distant, her demeanor cool and controlled, as though she were watching a play unfold from afar, observing rather than participating. One evening, I found myself alone in the study, staring at a painting on the wall, a quiet cityscape filled with soft, muted colors. It was a piece I had chosen years ago, one that had once brought me comfort. But now, as I looked at it, I felt only emptiness, a hollow ache that reminded me of all the years I had spent trying to fill a void I hadn't fully understood. David entered the room quietly, his presence a soothing balm against the silence. He approached slowly, his gaze fixed on the painting before he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice soft, "you don't have to live like this. Not anymore." His words echoed in the quiet room, a gentle promise that made my heart ache with longing. I turned to him, feeling the weight of my choices pressing down on me, the realization that I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. And in that moment, I knew that I couldn't stay here. Not in this life. Not in this hollow marriage that had become a prison. I needed freedom, a chance to reclaim the parts of myself that had been lost, to discover who I truly was without the weight of someone else's expectations. With a steady breath, I reached out, taking David's hand in mine. Together, we stood in the silence, each of us understanding that this was just the beginning, that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with the promise of something real, something worth fighting for. The final confrontation came 2 days later, in the quiet of the early morning. Richard had gone for a walk, his absence heavy with the knowledge that something was ending, something beyond his control. I found him by the edge of the East River, his gaze fixed on the still water, his expression filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. As I approached, he turned to me, his face unreadable. "So this is it?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness, a sense of loss for the life we had shared, the years we had spent together. "Yes, Richard," I said, "I think it is." He looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I never wanted this, Eleanor. I thought I could give you everything you needed. I thought I could make you happy." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, Richard, and you did, once. But people change. We can't keep pretending that things are the same, that we're the same." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the river. "So what happens now?" I took a deep breath, the weight of my decision settling over me. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I think it's time for both of us to find out." And with those words, I turned and walked away, the dawn breaking over the horizon, a new beginning waiting just beyond the edge of the city. Walking away from Richard that morning felt surreal, as though I were crossing into a world I'd only dreamed of, a place where I no longer had to conform to the quiet, predictable existence I had been living. But that freedom was accompanied by an unnerving fear, a whisper in my mind that asked, "What now?" When I returned to the apartment, David was waiting for me, his expression softening as he saw me. He stepped forward, his hand resting on my shoulder. "You did it, didn't you?" he murmured, his voice filled with both relief and concern. I nodded, barely able to speak. "It's over," I whispered. "At least, this part of it." He pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me in a silent reassurance, the warmth of his embrace chasing away the chill that had settled in my bones. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to simply exist in his arms without the weight of the past pressing down on me. But there was still a long road ahead. I couldn't ignore the fact that my entire life had been tied to Richard. Our home, our finances, even our friendships. Leaving him wasn't as simple as walking away. It meant unraveling the fabric of my own existence, facing a world that felt unfamiliar and uncertain. A few days later, I moved out of the penthouse and into David's brownstone in Brooklyn. We had agreed to take things slowly, to give ourselves time to heal from the upheaval of the past few weeks. But even as we settled into our new reality, I felt the ghost of my old life hovering just behind me, a presence that refused to be forgotten. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter from Richard's lawyer. He was filing for divorce, a move I had anticipated, but the details left me stunned. He wanted to keep nearly everything, our penthouse, the investments we'd built together, even the art collection I had carefully curated over the years. It was as though he were determined to erase every trace of me from our life, to reclaim the pieces of himself he believed I had stolen. When I showed the letter to David, his face darkened, his jaw tightening. "He's trying to punish you," he said quietly. "He can't bear the idea of you moving on without him, so he's making it as difficult as possible." I sighed, feeling the weight of Richard's betrayal settling over me. Part of me had hoped that we could part peacefully, that he would understand the need for us to go our separate ways, but I had underestimated the depth of his resentment, the way he would cling to control, even in our separation. "It doesn't matter," I said finally, steeling myself. "I won't let him take everything, not after everything I've given him." David nodded, his gaze steady. "You don't have to face this alone, Eleanor. Whatever happens, I'll be here." His words gave me strength, a reassurance that I wasn't facing this battle on my own. For the first time, I began to see a path forward, not as Richard's wife, but as a woman reclaiming her life, her independence. The divorce proceedings were brutal, a drawn-out affair that left me feeling drained and exhausted. Richard's lawyer was relentless, attacking every claim I made, challenging every detail of our life together. He wanted to paint me as the one who had strayed, who had broken the bonds of marriage through my connection with David. I sat through endless meetings, each one a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. But no matter how hard they tried to discredit me, I held firm, determined to keep the pieces of myself that Richard couldn't take away. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, I returned home to find David waiting for me. He had prepared a simple dinner, a small gesture that brought tears to my eyes. He didn't ask about the court proceedings. He simply held me, offering a quiet comfort that I had never known before. "It won't be like this forever," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Day you'll look back on this and realize how strong you were." His words resonated with me, a reminder that I was not just a wife or a possession to be discarded. I was a person in my own right, a woman fighting to reclaim her life. Over the following months, David and I grew closer, our bond deepening with each shared moment. He became more than a partner. He was a confidant, a friend, someone who saw me for who I truly was. And as the final days of the divorce proceedings drew near, I began to feel a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the life I was building. The day the divorce was finalized felt both like an ending and a beginning. Richard and I sat across from each other in the small, impersonal office of the courthouse, each of us carefully avoiding the other's gaze. He looked older, his face lined with anger and bitterness, a shadow of the man I had once loved. As we signed the final papers, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in years. But there was also a pang of sadness, a quiet mourning for the life we had shared, the dreams we had once built together. When it was over, I stood up, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Goodbye, Richard," I said softly, my voice filled with both regret and resolve. He looked at me, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Goodbye, Eleanor," he replied coldly, his voice devoid of warmth or affection. And with those words, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the empty courtroom. I took a deep breath, allowing myself a moment to feel the weight of my new reality. I was free, truly, finally free. But that freedom came with a cost, a quiet loneliness that lingered in the silence. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece. David was by my side through every step, offering support and encouragement as I navigated the unfamiliar world of independence. We moved into a small, cozy apartment together, a space that felt uniquely ours, filled with warmth and laughter. I returned to my work in the art world, taking on new projects and reconnecting with old friends. It felt strange stepping into this new chapter of my life without the weight of Richard's expectations pressing down on me, but with each passing day, I began to feel more comfortable, more at ease in my own skin. One evening, as David and I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, he took my hand, his gaze filled with quiet affection. "Lenore," he murmured, his voice soft. "Are you happy?" I paused, considering his question. Happiness had always felt elusive, a fleeting sensation that I could never quite hold on to. But in that moment, with David by my side and the weight of my old life finally lifted, I felt a glimmer of something real, something that felt like the beginning of true happiness. "Yes," I replied, my voice filled with quiet certainty. "For the first time in a long time, I am." Months passed, and life began to settle into a gentle, comforting rhythm. David and I shared a life that was simple yet fulfilling, a world filled with quiet moments and shared dreams. But just as I began to feel truly at peace, a letter arrived that shattered the calm. It was from Richard, a short, formal note requesting a meeting. My heart raced as I read his words, a mixture of fear and curiosity bubbling within me. After everything that had happened, I couldn't imagine what he wanted, but there was a part of me that couldn't ignore his request, a need for closure that lingered in the back of my mind. When I met him at a small cafe in Soho, I was surprised by how much he had changed. He looked tired, worn, his face lined with regret. "Eleanor," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I wanted to apologize for everything." His words took me by surprise, a quiet admission that felt both genuine and deeply unsettling. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, his gaze fixed on the table, "but I wanted you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I was blinded by my own fears, my own insecurities." I listened in silence, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. It was the apology I had longed for, yet it felt hollow, a reminder of the life we had lost. "Thank you, Richard," I replied quietly. "I appreciate it, but I've moved on. We both have." He nodded, his gaze distant, as though he were looking back on a life that felt like a distant memory. "I wish you happiness, Eleanor, truly." And with those words, he stood up and walked away, leaving me alone in the quiet cafe, the final chapter of our story finally closed.